The original Mass Effect trilogy is quite possibly one of the best science fiction gaming experiences that's ever been made, and it is a must play for any RPG fan. Mass Effect Andromeda would come along later, and it often gets looked at as the outcast of the bunch. In fact, it was raked over the coals for a myriad of reasons when it came out in 2017, and I personally thought it really couldn't hold a candle to its predecessors, chiefly Mass Effect 2, which I consider the apex of the franchise. But I'd go on to think about it in the years that followed, oddly drifting back to my experience with it from time to time. Was Andromeda unworthy of being a Mass Effect game? Or did I just never give it the chance it deserved, surrounded by the negative discourse from internet people who all seemed at the time to want the game to burn up in fiery flames? Was it really that bad? Since Mass Effect has always been one of my favorite franchises, I had to see for myself and play the game again 4 years later. Mass Effect Andromeda has the player controlling Sarah or Scott Ryder, who wakes up from cryosleep on the Hyperion Arc in the Andromeda Galaxy. 600 or so years ago, 3 of these arcs were sent out to find planets capable of supporting life. Obviously, things didn't go as planned, and none of the planets turned out to be habitable, so it's up to Ryder's team to find that new home. Or at the very least, just find out what happened to these quote-unquote golden worlds. It's a very straightforward introduction, serviceable with its slick cutscenes, though frankly I wouldn't consider it terribly interesting. I thought Mass Effect 2's Elusive Man and Lazarus Project was far more mysterious and gripping, probably the pinnacle of the series. But the initial mission on Habitat 7 does provide some decent introductory shootouts and very nice visuals, wherein the player can get used to the new mobility tools Ryder has. Starting with this, the gameplay in Andromeda is excellent and fast, possibly the best of the series, promoting much more moving and flanking and dashing around during combat instead of just exclusively sticking to hardcover. Cover-based shooting was a perfectly fine staple for the series considering the use of tactical abilities, player decision-making, and deploying teammate commands, but it did lead to a certain degree of immobility while playing. Shield regeneration amplified this issue, no doubt. Games like Uncharted and Mass Effect, with its 3rd and 4th installments, among a myriad of others, have all been trying to get away from stagnant cover gameplay in favor of emergent mobile gameplay, encouraging players to do more than just play whack-a-mole while they wait for their health to recharge. BioWare hasn't perfected the system yet, it came closer with Anthem, and Mass Effect Andromeda is actually not too far behind. Zipping around in combat feels unorthodox at first for a Mass Effect game, but ultimately it has a very positive impact on the game's variety, as players can now jump, hover, dash, and air dash while in combat while they use their abilities. There is no longer a need to simply sit behind a perfectly placed box and wait for an enemy head to pop up. These contrivances in level design are everywhere actually. Even some of the best games of all time are guilty of constructing the perfect artificial cover system, even if it doesn't make sense for the game in question. The only reason guards would place these boxes like this is to let Joel and Tess have an easier job killing them. Andromeda moves away from this. It still has the manufactured level design, but the player has so much more maneuverability that they might not even notice. This retooled movement system and a push towards mobility was likely a byproduct or inversely the motivation of streamlining the squadmate system. Mass Effect Andromeda no longer allows players to command their squadmates' abilities, only where to stand. Issuing direct ability commands was a key feature of prior Mass Effect games, and you could even hotkey squad abilities to your controller buttons so you didn't have to pause the game as much. Without a functional squad targeting system, Andromeda ends up feeling much less tactical in play. In fact, utilizing your squad isn't actually necessary on most difficulties. Instead, Andromeda is more about keeping on the move and just blowing shit up, and then moving on and doing it again. It's less planning and more reacting. The immediate benefit of this system is that combat never gets interrupted unless the player uses a power-up. This, combined with the flashy combo system that looks and sounds incredible even 4 years later, transforms Andromeda into much more of an action game than the series has ever been known for. Another piece of evidence pointing to the shifting focus is players only having 3 skill slots. Prior, Shepard could pause the game and pull up a wheel to use a medley of abilities on command. Obviously this slowed down the game a lot, but the player had a lot more stuff to play with, so there was a trade-off there. What Andromeda offers instead is loadouts, wherein the player can set up different 3 ability setups they've spent points on and switch between them during combat. This expands their skill repertoire and promotes that sense of versatility that the skills wheel did with prior games. However, in practice, it doesn't really make that much difference because you still have to pause the game to switch profiles. Plus, you're also penalized via a cooldown timer, which you can't cast any spells from either profile. They're generally the suboptimal way to play the game based on how Andromeda sets up its character progression too. Because the player only has 3 ability slots, gamers are strongly encouraged to max out 3 of their favorite abilities that synergize, and then dump the rest of their points into passive abilities, to which huge benefits can be accrued without the need to swap profiles. If the player wants to have more than 3 abilities, they'll either have to rotate them in and out via the skills menu, respec in the medbay, or build another profile so they can have them available during combat. If they do so, one of those profiles isn't going to be used in combat while the other one is active, so you can see the problem. The player essentially loses out on all of the skill points invested into the profile that is waiting to be switched to, assuming no overlap in skill selection. You'd want another profile for the sake of variety, so that will always be the case. So the points essentially get wasted and could have otherwise gone to passive abilities within a single profile to increase weapon damage, for example, shields, team damage, biotics, regeneration, AoE damage, etc. The smart choice is just to stick to a single profile if you're playing on harder difficulties, which makes the system obsolete. Because you can't control your team's abilities, you pretty much have to do everything yourself, so it's important to optimize your build. Squad mates aren't useless, they'll use their powers, though randomly it seems. Sometimes they'll detonate their combos, sometimes accidentally detonating yours if possible, or at worst they'll just kind of stand around shooting. The AI is respectable, if not slightly juvenile in Andromeda, companions being fairly capable of doing appropriate damage and taking cover when they're hurt, but without any tools to control their combat action, you simply can't rely on them. Thus, I ended up ignoring everything about the squad system, and honestly the profile system too. Regarding other changes to gameplay, specifically movement, the new smooth cover system is extremely responsive, allowing Ryder to move in and out of cover without any hindrance whatsoever. You can even do some tricks with terrain that look pretty badass. So kudos to the team for refining the cover system in this fashion. However, jumping and jetpacking isn't as polished. There's a small delay after jumping or using the jetpack when the rider hits the ground. She sort of stumbles a bit, just for a brief second, which I admit looks realistic, considering, science and stuff, but it also makes the game feel pretty jerky, even though Ryder has more mobility than Shepard ever had. This stutter is one of the more inconspicuous little devils in Andromeda, especially when jumping and platforming. One of the things game developers solved decades ago was the basic idea that players can hit 2 buttons within a very short amount of time and know exactly what state their character will be in after they've performed their actions. This goes back to the days of Mario on Nintendo. When there's a delay between basic moves, such as when Ryder hits the ground after jumping, using her jetpack, or spinning around, the player has to guess if the game is ready to accept their next input. Or worse, if they've already made that input, such as another jump, if the game registered it. If the case was no, aka they pressed the button too soon, the jump just won't happen even though the player has already told the game they want Ryder to jump. What often happens is you actually hit jump twice because you're not sure if the game read your command, which causes Ryder to bounce in place like a little bunny. This stoppy stardiness in Ryder's basic moves is, I know, almost stupid to point out as this is an RPG after all, but you'd be surprised how much jumping and platforming there is, especially in combat and solving remnant puzzles, and even more so inside Andromeda's vaults, which there are about a half a dozen of. If you've ever experienced latency issues when playing a fighting game online, it's the same concept. Delays make things sticky and unresponsive. What makes the platforming really sad though is that the Frostbite engine also has very inconsistent hitboxes for ledge grabbing, and I think you can see how this would be a problem. This idea to add more platforming in the Mass Effect, just because we now have a jump jet, is not a bad idea. In fact, I think it's a perfectly good idea. Given the open world and the futuristic nature of the game, one could imagine a lot of possibilities that could emerge for new types of gameplay. But unfortunately for Andromeda, it's just mostly awkward jumping challenges. Speaking of exploration, Andromeda features a handful of worlds and lots of mini-planets to visit, and frankly, they're all goddamn beautiful. From a visual standpoint, Andromeda does a really great job with diversity. Each planet has a distinct feeling to them. Vold's bleak, frozen vastness is incredibly different to Havarl's serene purple jungles or Elodin's bleached deserts. Each of those large planets has a unique story to it, typically dealing with some sort of hazard that needs to be fixed by finding its corresponding vault. Radiation on Eos, heat on Elodin, water issues on Kadara, the plant life on Havarl, etc. But unfortunately, they're inconsistent when finding things to do though. Vold's just too empty, Aya doesn't have enough missions, but typically the main story thread cutting through them is worth doing, even if the vaults could have done with a lot more variety. Having gone open world, Andromeda had an important issue to tackle, which is to balance its mandatory content, or the story, with its optional content, side quests, collecting, exploring, etc. The best open world RPGs, they tend to keep the central story arc present while providing meaty side content that, while is optional, still feels very important because they may tie back to critical themes or characters or conflicts within the story. This ensures players will want to seek those things out while they advance through the story, versus having a sprawling sea of fluffy open world meringue that is typically so goddamn pointless. Andromeda is a really big game with a thorough list of missions, planets, assignments, world events, galaxy exploration, collecting, mining, and tasks to do. Once you complete the prologue, you can pretty much dip into whatever you want. It's unfortunate much of the content, though, is quite throwaway. Beyond priority missions, companion side quests, and planet-specific story threads, there's a lot of unnecessary stuff in Andromeda, led of course by those dreaded map markers. Most tasks, outposts, fetch quests, and the like are just dull and overly abundant, and mining, finding chests, and scanning are not only mechanically unsatisfying, but they can be abrasive in the sense that upgrading and crafting requires just flat out way too many materials. More importantly though, these activities pull players towards them, not for narrative purposes, but for the sake of mechanics, which creates distance from the conflicts of the game and motivations of our hero and villain. They do strongly represent things that Pathfinder might actually do, but I'll never give brownie points to any system that doesn't fundamentally enhance the experience of a game from start to finish. One of the things that results from open world activities that aren't inherently satisfying or add to the story is burnout. We don't want players looking at an RPG as a dreaded to-do list, because that can hurt their core playthrough if they can't figure out how to sift through it or what to focus on. When a main quest is under 10 hours, but it might take you 40 to finish the game, you have to stop and ask yourself what you've actually been doing. Barring loading screens, unskippable bits, and getting to and from, what is the actual content mix? And looking back on Andromeda, it's a lot of the traditional open world agenda. Tasks, busy work, crafting, driving around, collecting things, setting up outposts, killing bad guys at enemy outposts, and running lots of errands for the locals. It's very clear when a quest is important in Andromeda, and if it's not, it typically doesn't enhance the story in a meaningful way. What you're really doing with most of Andromeda's side content is simply powering up, gearing up, leveling up, and filling up bars like cryptopods, strike team currency, and planet viability. Certainly the latter is important for narrative purposes, but if we're being honest, we all know it's not gravely important to increase Kadara's viability from 90% to 100% to find Meridian. The best way to enjoy Andromeda is to filter the game's content yourself, as it always doesn't do the best job doing it for you. Chasing quest icons and sending out probes to every system are the last things you want to be doing in Andromeda because they are endless. Heading out into the mountains to scan rocks or collect every bauble you see is fun for an hour, but then you realize these things actually don't really matter. Making this mistake is like trying to 100% the hinterlands in Dragon Age Inquisition without leaving it, which is an act of madness. This fatigue factor in Andromeda is not as bad as Inquisition, but it does succumb to this, and I think it's one of the black marks on the game because it just ends up feeling very bloated. The open world is not the problem. In fact, I think having a wide, free-roaming galaxy to explore is incredible on paper, as it opens up so many possibilities, not to mention make playthroughs entirely unique. But the more you stretch a game space outwards, the harder it becomes to fill it with things that actually matter. Thankfully, Andromeda makes at least an effort to curb the frustration of this by organizing quests in folders in your journal. Most of the tedium comes from erroneous fetch quests, markers, and banal tasks on your map, so this is actually really helpful. However, it should be a signal that perhaps maybe the fat should have been trimmed beforehand if we're going to be dumping all the unimportant stuff in a trash bin called tasks. Andromeda is best played instead by completing all of the companion quests, finding the arcs, and doing each planet-specific story thread before finishing the game, ignoring all the tasks and all the mumbo-jumbo collection icons when out and about. This will take you about 15 to 20 hours, which just might be the sweet spot for a Mass Effect game. And sure enough, 4 years later, this is exactly what I did, and it collectively made for a better experience than the first time I played it. Granted, Mass Effect Andromeda is still very inconsistent, and though it has some good quests, they're very hit and miss. This isn't BioWare's best work here. If I had to go back and play my favorite Mass Effect quests, honestly, none of them would come from Andromeda. It's not to say that the best Andromeda quests are actually bad, they're just not as memorable or iconic. Context was a big part of the original Mass Effect games, offering a smaller amount of very laser-focused linear missions with a lot of effort put into progression of each mission. Missions were far more progressive feeling and escalating. They felt like self-contained mini-stories of great importance. These more often than not had really great level design and setup with interesting cinematography and a lot more moral choices in the end. Andromeda doesn't have as much of this, though overall the level design for the gameplay with its enhanced verticality makes the moment-to-moment gameplay almost always better. However, as an RPG, story and characters tend to be just as critical as gameplay, and most missions in Andromeda they end up lacking that emotional weight of other Dragon Age or Mass Effect games. Take a second to think back to Tally Treason, the Suicide Mission, Lair of the Shadow Broker, Vermeer, the Collector Ship, that opening scene of Mass Effect 2. All of these missions were unforgettable, and when you line them up to Mass Effect Andromeda, really the only mission that comes anywhere near close is the final chase on Meridian, the rescue mission on Vold, and the lengthy conflict on the Solarian arc where you meet Pathfinder Reka. It's because these missions have a sense of escalation and progression is why they're compelling. You're not just going from map icon A to map icon B, you're being taken through an actual story, a multi-layered scenario akin to a tiny film, almost. Exposition, conflict, rising action, danger, climax, resolution. The little things that matter, a monologue of hope and legacy. Out of the Frying Pan, High Noon, Movie Night, Search for the Stolen Remnant Drive Core, and Making an Impression on EOS. You can make the case for these being good, but you would never consider these missions epic to the extent that they were in the original Mass Effect or Dragon Age games. And as such, I know BioWare can do a lot better. Mission design is where I think Andromeda misses the mark the most. There's a lot of running around during quests, flying to markers the game wants you to go to, and talking to various people during the quest chain, sometimes in other systems. In my opinion, Mass Effect is best when each mission is linear and has clearly defined storytelling, action, and climax, and the open world of Andromeda ends up body-blocking this staple design. I'm fine with flying to another planet to advance a quest storyline, but sometimes very little happens and you just have to do it too much. The quest Contagion I think is the staple example here, where you have to find someone plagued by an incurable disease and stop the spread, which sounds great but it's just riddled with so much busy work. I even found a mission from an NPC on Vold that made me go back to the Tempest to read an email from him and then fly back to talk to the guy that had just sent the email. The paradox is a gentle reminder that Andromeda is very inconsistent across the board, which goes for its characters as well. BioWare does go to decent lengths to develop most of the characters inside this game, even though some of them are pretty forgettable like Liam and Cora. They're basically the equivalent of Jacob and Ashley from Mass Effect 3, which is not a compliment. The rest of the cast is alright, but not great. Nothing's ever gonna come close to Garrus, Thane, Liara, Mordin, Miranda, etc., but they do have their charm. PB's rebelliousness, Jaws growing into a complex character over the course of the game, Vetra and Drac bonding over family. Taking the time to investigate these stories is actually rewarding. Again, you won't find the iconic Mordin Solus moment, you won't find this either.
I'm quite good at genetics as a subset of biology because I am an expert which I know is a tautology. My xenoscience studies range from urban to agrarian. I am the very model of a scientist Solarian.
Or experience the doomy gloomy tragedies of Tali or Legion or any other heartbreaking tale so eloquently told. But you will find a lot of effort into how the characters feel present while the player is controlling Ryder, more so than any Mass Effect. The ambient conversations in the Tempest, the constant chit-chat in the Nomad between your squad mates. There are hours of this stuff.
Oh, screw it. I want you. Let's do it.
All right, pull over. I'll give you two some privacy.
I knew you were faking.
Barring the elevator conversations from Mass Effect 1, this friendly banter was mostly absent up until Mass Effect 3. Characters commenting on your romantic status or having more dialogue during mission briefs happen way more often too. Truth be told, the overall writing borders on weak.
Buy me a drink sometime. Who knows what will spill out of my mouth. I appreciate the warm welcome. It's a joke. To break the ice. Get it? Warm welcome? Ice?
Kill me now.
I knew running off to Andromeda would be dangerous, but shit. This is dangerous.
Archon, don't blame your people. This clusterfuck is all you.
Animation and performance rigid as a frozen popsicle, but I did like the interplay between squad mates a lot more than any other Mass Effect game. If Mass Effect Andromeda's characters didn't have to follow some of the most beloved icons in RPG history, I truly don't think they would have been that bad. The Archon and the brainless army of Ket soldiers, though, are really bad, which look eerily familiar to the Flood from the Halo franchise. They're evil space orcs for evil's sake, while also being extremely dull and generic. The Archon acts like Corypheus from Dragon Age 2, who appears early on in the game with a show of tremendous force, spitting out his own claims of domination, only to be beaten by our heroes every single time his puppets show up. He's kind of like Mass Effect's rendition of Kylo Ren. The Archon has potential, the execution just isn't there because he's so one-dimensional. Over the course of the game we learn some things about the Archon's motivations of the Ket and his quest for exaltation, and he does outwit Ryder's team towards the end of the game, but his motivation is always so singular and so narrow in scope. There's simply no complexity to him beyond the classic "I'm taking over the world, try and stop me, you little peon" archetype. Calpurnia from Dragon Age Inquisition is a great example of how you can write a villain who has nuanced desires, to which the Archon has none and could have benefited from greatly. I know a new team at BioWare made Andromeda, but it is a shame that other villains like the Elusive Man and Saren share the same screen name as the Archon. Now regarding Ryder, she suffers from being a little bit too amicable and meek at times, slanting towards even being forgettable, but the story at least suits her and she develops well over the course of the game. It presents her just as a normal person, responsible for a great deal, and she struggles with it. She's not the ideal choice for a hero, but appropriate for a story that doesn't hang by the knife's edge of a galactic war. She's naive and far too agreeable at times, almost to the point of being the direct opposite of Shepard, but it's again suitable as Andromeda's tale is much more lighthearted. She's a pathfinder, not a warrior, a fill-in at that. She's not powerful or forceful, she's resourceful, with a mission to find a home for the people of the Nexus. There is indeed plenty of warfare, sure, but the Pathfinder's mission is exploring and settling, so her less authoritative demeanor I think is actually quite appropriate. I imagine the reason I didn't like Ryder on my first playthrough was because I missed Shepard's self-assuredness and general badassery, as traditionally most video game heroes have that quality, and I think it's easy to think Ryder as somewhat of a pushover. Andromeda suffers from post-trilogy syndrome. Anything that isn't Shepard is seen as a hulking disappointment from beloved fans. However, when stepping back and analyzing it as a game built on the idea of exploring unknowns, she's definitely not the worst character they could have written, and honestly, I kind of ended up liking her by the end of it. You do though see a lot more fluctuation in tone and personality with the new conversation system. The removal of the Paragon Renegade system creates pros and cons for the new game. On one hand, now you have a lot more options, which gives Ryder a broader range, though as a cost, there's much less definitiveness to her character. I always liked the Paragon system in Mass Effect, however the more I played Andromeda, the more I actually didn't miss it. Though Shepard was an amazing character, the system forced a lot of extremes onto him/her, due to its rigid morality system. For me, it was less about choosing the best response at the time, and more about making sure I was staying in line with the red or blue choice. Instead of selecting the good or jerk response, this time around we get a variety of tonal responses. Empathetic, witty, straight-laced, neutral, etc. I think any RPG that removes one of its stat bars or tracking systems is ultimately a good thing, as you don't have to worry about being penalized for doing something that conflicts with a choice you made 10 hours ago. Especially when that game will lock you out of future choices because you didn't have enough points in one or the other. As a result, it makes role-playing Ryder actually more natural, so much so that you might even stop paying attention to what those little icons on the conversation wheel represent altogether. And as a result, there's no definitive good or bad choices in Andromeda. You just get a character named Ryder that is a reflection of how you feel, which is definitely still role-playing despite the fact that you're not labeled in any way, shape, or form. Almost every time I go back to a game years later, I find myself in a new mindset, and away from the hype, I can typically find a better or broader appreciation for the game in question. This was the case with Mass Effect Andromeda to an extent, as I eliminated everything I didn't enjoy about it and just stuck to what the game does pretty well. I obviously couldn't get away from the mediocre writing, the horrendous loading screens, the fiddly puzzles, the vaults, the horrible villain, and a few of my squad mates who could have been so much more. And by trimming all the fat out of my play, I can say that I had a fairly enjoyable time with it, more so than I actually expected. It hasn't changed my mind about the game, I still find it above average. The intense gameplay, the visuals, the customization, the weapon system, and the pathfinding bits of the story, they're all great, but the rest is stuff I can get better elsewhere. Mass Effect Andromeda is a great example of a game that can be quite fun if you can be your own filtration system, but not one that is ever going to convince me that this is the peak of what an RPG can be or a Mass Effect game. Though with that said, I'd still recommend playing it if you're a Mass Effect fan, even after all these years. Thank you so much for watching. Before I finish up the video, I would like to thank today's sponsor, NordVPN. NordVPN is one of the easiest ways you can protect yourself online. It creates an encrypted tunnel between your device and the host you're trying to access, which hides your IP address, keeps your information private, and allows you to safely use the internet, whether it's at home, traveling, or simply using public Wi-Fi hotspots. For me, this peace of mind is really the best part about using a VPN. And if you're interested, go to nordvpn.com/DWT to save 70% on a 2-year plan and get 1 month free. Thanks for watching again, guys. I know my video upload schedule has been slower lately, and when I say lately, I pretty much mean the entire last year. I've made a pretty big effort to change the way I make videos, and I hope you've noticed that this channel isn't the same as it used to be. Its focus is now on games critique and creative writing for video games, rather than dramatic news stories. And I'm really proud of that change. So thanks for all your feedback and your support. You guys take care, and we'll see you in the next video.